Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me join you today. Uh, I want to share with you a story about Michigan's Indian history. And I think it's really not at all appreciated uh, nationally, but frankly, even in Michigan, how unique Michigan's Indian history has been. And had the American government in the 19th century paid attention to the experiments that were done uh, in Indian relations in Michigan, uh, the sorry story of American Indian relations in the late 19th century uh, might have been less sorry. Michigan is different than neighboring states such as Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, uh, who don't have a native resident population. For so much of the Midwest region, Native American experience is something of myth, legend, uh, because of the ethnic cleansing that took place in the 1830s. Michigan Native people, not all of them, but a significant number of tribal communities managed to avoid that. And that, in many ways, is the backdrop of the story that we're going to tell tonight. The particular focus of this story is Northwest Michigan, particularly up around Emmett County, Leelanau County, Traverse City area. As a native Chicagoan, born and raised and residing in the Windy City, I'd always been interested in American Indian stories, but I came to the story of Andrew Blackbird and the Odawa people through my public history work, consulting, in this case, with the government of Michigan. Between 1998 and 2005, the United States government, acting as trustee for a series of Native communities in Michigan, sued the state of Michigan. The purpose of this litigation was to determine if treaty rights that guaranteed Native people a right to hunt and fish outside of state regulation, rights that had been guaranteed in 1836 and 1855, were those rights still in place? And if they were, what kind of limitations could be legally put upon them? In the course of doing research to answer those questions, the key thing that an historian has to keep in mind is that according to federal Indian law, treaties and agreements such as that have to be interpreted based on how the Native people at the time of the treaty understood those provisions. So when I came across a small book by Andrew Blackbird called A History of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan, and began to read it and saw that here was an Odawa man who had written this sort of history of his people, but it was very much also a story of his own life and of his people's struggle to stay in Michigan. I was excited because here was something rare. Normally, when we do American Indian history, particularly treaties, almost all the evidence that we're able to bring to bear is from the written records of white Americans. And we have to sort of extrapolate the Native American point of view from these records produced by missionaries or by government officials. But here was Andrew Blackbird, a member of the Odawa people who fought against the United States attempts to remove them, talking about the story from his perspective. And through his book, I learned about the people of the Little Traverse Bay Band of the Odawa. Their homeland was known as L'Arbre Croche, or French for the land of the crooked tree. And Andrew Blackbird in his book describes a continuous village 15 miles long along Lake Michigan's Little Traverse Bay. If you're doing research historically, I think it's always crucial that you know intimately the places where that history happened. And while landscapes and things change so much over the centuries, it's still important, I think, to go there and get a feel for things. And so after reading Andrew Blackbird's book, I wanted to visit the places that are mentioned there. And so that brought me up to Emmett County, Michigan. And I was driving up from Petoskey, the county seat, to Cross Village, which is a contemporary Native community in far northern tip of Michigan's mitten. Along the way, I stopped at a small little general store on the side of the road. And it said it was in Goodheart, Michigan. It was just this general store, there was nothing else. So after getting a Coke, I noticed there was a little two-track road that went off away from the store. And I had a little time, so I thought I'll just go down that road and see what's what. And I came to this church, the Church of St. Ignatius. And I realized that Goodheart, Michigan was located right in the middle of that continuous village of 12 miles. And it was known as being the core of the Odawa community there. So I walked up to this, and just you can see it's a beautiful little church. You think you're in New England or something. But what really impressed me was that as I went into the church, and there's nobody around. This is just a completely, and I was surprised to see the church was even open, because in Chicago, they lock them up right after Mass. And I went into the church, and I saw it was the Church of St. Ignatius. At that point, I'd worked for a quarter century at Loyola University in Chicago, where St. Ignatius is a pretty big guy. And from a pamphlet in the church vestibule, I learned that this church, which had been built in the 1880s, was built on the exact spot of the first Jesuit mission in the early 18th century. And that the graves that you see in the foreground of this picture were the graves of the native people who had been converted by missionaries. It gave me a powerful sense of being in the presence of the past. And I wanted to kind of think about that. And so after visiting the cemetery, I walked toward the lake, which was only 50 yards away. Well, here's a picture of that village, Goodheart, as it existed in the late 19th century. You can see some of the Indian cabins that had once surrounded the church. I walked over to the lakefront and sat down. And again, there was nobody anywhere around. And the only sound was the water lapping against the shore. And I thought about the graves of those people who had been converted. And I wondered how many of them had been the signers of that 1836 treaty in which the Odawa had given up control of most of western northern Michigan. I thought about Andrew Blackbird and the way he had described life in this village. And then something kind of eerie happened. I put my hand down, and in the sand next to me was a black feather that you could see there to the right of the slide. A blackbird feather. And from that point on, I said, I'm going to tell this guy's story. Andrew Blackbird, at the beginning of his book, describes the way in which the Odawa people, and Odawa, of course, means to trade, and the Odawa were tremendous traders and navigators of the Great Lakes environment. For them, the Great Lakes were merely a highway for their birch bark canoes. And his family was spread out across the upper Great Lakes region. His great uncle was the famous Chief Pontiac, who lived not too far from Monroe County. His uncle, Asiganak, lived on Manitoulin Island in the far northern reaches of Lake Huron. Blackbird's father's hunting camp was in central Michigan, in Mecosta County. But before that, as a young man, he'd hunted all across the Northwest into Saskatchewan and Manitoba. His uncle Shabona lived with the Potawatomi in the Chicago area. So, as a young person, Andrew was exposed to a wide swath of the upper Great Lakes region. The Odawa were great farmers, and they had tremendously large cornfields along the shores of Little Traverse Bay. And the corn that was produced there was what allowed fur traders coming from Montreal or from New York City to get to Mackinac Island and to refurbish their supplies and then carry the fur trade not only to Green Bay, but eventually into the far northwestern regions across Grand Portage in Lake Superior. And that was the work of Odawa women. Odawa men were trappers who sold their furs on Mackinac Island, but also fished in the Great Lakes for lake trout and whitefish. In addition to being very successful at marketing the fish and the corn that they grew, they were jealous of protecting their Michigan homeland. And the native people of Michigan fought more successfully to protect their homelands than I think any other native group in what is now the United States. In colonial times, they were among the war parties that defeated General Braddock in 1754 when he tried to go ahead and march and destroy Fort Duquesne that began the French and Indian War. And they were among the warriors at Fort William Henry, so famously depicted in Last of the Mohicans. They were among the warriors who fought with Pontiac in the 1763 attempt to drive the British from the Great Lakes region. In the 1770s, Odawa warriors journeyed far. Always they're journeying far from their homeland. They're attempting to keep the white invaders at bay at more than arm's length distance. So they're willing to go ahead and go long distances to fight. During the Revolution, Indians were more successful at killing Americans than the British Army was. One reason the British Army lost. In the 1790s, Odawa warriors were joined with the Miami, the Pankashaw, and the Shawnee to twice defeat American armies George Washington sent against them into Ohio. And then, of course, finally, in the last really organized resistance to American power, Tecumseh's Confederacy, the Odawa played a significant role in that. So these were great warriors who went ahead and used their skill at long distance transport to go ahead and keep the American empire at bay. And a key figure in all of this was Andrew Blackbird's father, a warrior by the name of Mekatepensi. He was a strong follower of Tecumseh and Tecumseh's brother, the Shawnee Prophet. And he led many war parties against the Americans. In the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, there is a marvelous artifact that documents the last Odawa War Party against the United States. This wooden canoe was carved by Jean-Baptiste Siganac, who was Andrew Blackbird's uncle. And he documents how Siganac, Mekatepensi, Blackbird's father, and a group of other warriors got into a canoe at Little Traverse Bay, went down the shores of Lake Michigan to St. Joseph River, then up to St. Joseph, hooked up by portage to the Wabash, and went down to southern Indiana, where they ambushed a United States Army patrol, capturing one of its members and bringing him back as a prisoner in triumph to the British garrison on Mackinac Island, only to learn that while they were gone, the War of 1812 had ended, and the British had promised to abandon their Indian allies. And with the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, the Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi, known as the Anishinaabe, they realized that military resistance to the United States was going to no longer be possible, and that they had to come to terms with the American Republic. It is in the wake of this war that Andrew Blackbird is born. And he grows up in the hunting and fishing camps in the interior of Michigan and spending his summers in Little Traverse Bay. And about the time he was born, a delegation from the United States government disquieted the Odawa at Little Traverse. Governor Lewis Cass, who was, of course, the governor of the Michigan Territory, was sent by the president with a presidential representative to the American Indian people, Reverend Jedediah Morris. He was sent to go ahead and convince the Native people that they needed to adopt American civilization. And Morris, in a very, very ungracious and insulting manner, hectored the assembled Odawa leaders. And he concluded his address disparaging their culture and their future and their history and their traditions. And he concluded the address by saying, "You will accept our missionaries. You will have civilization or ruin." The Odawa made no response to his address. And when he left, they kept their own counsel and sought advice from friends and relations among the white traders at Mackinac Island. Morris had said you had to adopt Christianity. You must accept the missionaries that will be sent by the United States government. They didn't like the sound of that. But on the other hand, they knew they had to come to terms with the Americans. There was no opposing them militarily any longer. So they thought, could there be a way we could finesse this? And they remembered the Jesuit missionaries who had come to them beginning in the 1650s. Missionaries like Father Jacques Marquette. These Jesuit missionaries didn't make a ton of converts among the Odawa. On the other hand, they didn't force them to change their culture either. And they had been part of an accommodation that had allowed the Odawa to live very successfully and in concert with the French fur traders who came in the wake of the Jesuits. So what the Anishinaabe, and this would be both the Odawa and the Ojibwa in northern Michigan, decided to do was that they would accommodate themselves to the Americans, but do so in a way to protect their culture. They would resist the attempts of the government to take away their identity as Odawa people. Andrew Blackbird's father, Mecca DeBency, who had been schooled in a Catholic missionary school near Montreal when he was very young, writes to the Pope in Rome and says, well, we need some Jesuit missionaries. You used to send them here back in the day. Now we need them again. One of the advantages of this outreach to the Catholics was that the Catholics were kind of in the outs with the United States government. Catholics were very much a suspect minority in the United States. But on the other hand, they were Christian. Well, the Catholic Church, of course, in the early 19th century is very weak in the United States. And the church just cannot send any missionaries to this very, very remote Native community. But as I mentioned, Andrew Blackbird's father, Mecca DeBency, had learned how to read and write in the Anishinaabe language when he was young. And his brother, Jean-Baptiste Siganac, both of their names, you know, they sound very different. They both mean blackbird. He was a devout Catholic. And so the two brothers then decide, okay, we can't get a missionary here. We're going to begin to self-evangelize the Odawa, at least those who want to become Catholic. And so they brought Catholic hymnals, and they began to do Catholic services. Of course, they couldn't do sacraments, but they sang hymns. They built a birch bark chapel for these services. And they had these Catholic prayer books that Mecca DeBency then taught them. You can see on the slide in the center there, you can see the way the Odawa syllabary looked. Those are Odawa words that translate as Christian prayers. As their activities flourished, they were not always popular with some Odawa who wanted to protect the traditional religious traditions. And so the Catholics decided to form their own community, and they moved to a place they called the New L'Arbre Croche, which later became Harbor Springs, Michigan, on the shores of Little Traverse Bay. Missionaries finally come in 1829. And shortly after that, the whole mission at Harbor Springs is under the stewardship of Frederick Baraga, the famous snowshoe priest Andrew Blackbird's sister, Margaret, is sent to Cincinnati, where she's going to learn Christian Catholic doctrine so that she can become a teacher. Andrew's older brother, William, is sent to Cincinnati, where he does so well that he, as well as one of Andrew's cousins, are sent all the way to Rome with the intent that they will be trained to become priests. Andrew, of course, is very young at this point, and so he is simply in the newly established Catholic parish school. Now, the Catholic educational effort that's launched at Little Traverse is kind of unique and somewhat problematic from a point of view of the Odawa. The priests that were sent to attend the mission and set up the mission schools were generally from Slovenia. As Slovenians, they knew Slovenian language, of course. It's part of the Austrian Empire, so they knew German. They're part of the Catholic priesthood, so they knew Latin. What they didn't know was English. They were decent linguists, as you might imagine, learning all those languages. And so they also did learn to speak the Odawa language, but their English was never that great. And what their goal was to create were close-knit Catholic sacramental communities, sacramental parishes for the native people that would be protected from American civilization. Very different than what the Protestant schools that the United States government at this time was sponsoring for many native groups, whose purpose was to take away Indian identity, take away Indian language. So throughout the whole of the 19th century, the Odawa are always being missioned to by Catholic missionaries who are generally from Eastern or Central Europe. A problem, however, occurs for Andrew's relationship with the Catholic Church when word comes in 1832 that Andrew's older brother, on the eve of his ordination as a priest, dies. It turns out that he was in a carriage accident, and this caused his demise. But word didn't get back for over a year after it happened as to how he died. And in the year from learning that he did die and as to how he died, all kinds of rumors spread. And Blackbird's family believed that he was killed by American Catholics because they didn't want an educated Indian returning to Michigan. There's really no basis of fact in that, but it's the power of rumor. On top of that, shortly after that, 2 years later, Andrew Blackbird's mother dies. Now, he's just a lad of 14. His mother died in an accident. At this point, the Odawa are expanding their making of maple sugar so that they can sell this for cash in the markets at Mackinac Island. And so they had these very large tubs of melting sugar, melting syrup, as they're cooking it so it can be granulated. And she was scalded to death in a very awful manner. What the impact of this is that this really leaves Andrew kind of at loose ends. At the age of maybe 14, he doesn't really have anybody watching over him. He becomes a bit of a vagabond. And then a third kind of tragedy strikes the Odawa, and that's, of course, Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy that forces the 5 civilized tribes out of the southeast, tribes the Odawa out of northern Ohio, the Miami and the Potawatomi out of Indiana and southern Michigan. And it's clear that the government is going to be setting its sights on the native people of northern Michigan. In the slide on your left, you go ahead and see the area that was ceded in the Treaty of Washington, 1836. And in this agreement, the Odawa and the Ojibwa in that part of Michigan cede 14 million acres in exchange for 12 cents an acre of annuity payments. Now, when they initially signed the treaty, they were given reservations which they were told would be theirs in perpetuity. The Odawa reservation was virtually all of what is today Emmett County, Michigan. However, this was a treaty negotiated in Washington, D.C. When their representatives returned home, and about 6 months later, they were told to gather at Mackinac Island, that now the treaty had been passed by the United States Senate, and the government was requesting them to put their signatures on a treaty that had been amended by the U.S. Senate, and now said those reservations will not be held in perpetuity. Instead, they will expire in 10 years, and the native people will then be asked to move to Kansas. But the Little Traverse Odawa signed this agreement, and they signed it very knowingly, because they've been working with their Catholic priests, and they've come up with a plan. Those annuity payments of gold that they will receive once a year from the United States government, they're going to save those and then use them to buy land as private citizens in Emmett County, what becomes Emmett County, Michigan. This will give them civil status, and as property owners, they will attempt to avoid removal that way. However, it's clear that the old ways of living as a warrior or as a hunter, which were the two twin identities of a Native American man, those ways are gone. And here's young Andrew. He's kind of roaming around a lot on his own. And he tries to explore what is this new world that's going to come after we've ceded our territory. How should I live? How should I make my way? For a time, he works on the crew of a Great Lakes schooner. He does a stint as a harvest hand on a grain farm near Green Bay, Wisconsin. And for a year, he works as a clerk in a Mackinac Island trading post. And there, he's confronted with an offer that scares him, but also begins to get him thinking about his future. He meets a man by the name of Alvin Cole, Protestant missionary from Ohio, who says to him, look, you're kind of estranged from the Catholic services that all the other Odawa are going to. Why don't you come back with me to Ohio, and I can teach you so you can learn English properly, you can get a full education, and I can, of course, teach you Presbyterian Christianity. And he says, if you want to do this, meet me tonight at the dock, the steamboats heading down to Detroit in the evening. And Andrew's very excited to go. But that night, when it's time for the steamboat to leave, it's blowing its whistle to announce its departure. Andrew is simply laying in his bunk, petrified to act. And the opportunity to go and get an education leaves with that ship and without him. He realizes the next morning that he made a terrible mistake. And so he seizes the next opportunity he can get to try to make his way in the world. And that was an offer to become an assistant blacksmith paid by the United States Indian Department at a place called Mission Point on Grand Traverse Bay. And he works 4 years there. Part of the Indian agency created by the government as part of the 1836 treaty is a Protestant mission there. And Andrew begins to go ahead and learn about the Presbyterian approach to Christianity. He takes a temperance vow. And at one point, he is confronted at gunpoint by Indians who want to get whiskey, and he prevents them from doing so. But he's not really getting an education except learning how to become a blacksmith. And this is on an Ojibwa reservation. And he's very much regarded as an outsider, as an Odawa. So in 1845, he decides, I'm going to go to Ohio on my own. I'm going to try to find this Reverend Alvin Cole, and he can help me then get a real education. Well, when the steamboat arrives in Cleveland and he gets out, he realizes, oh my God, there's like white people everywhere. How am I going to make my way? I have only a few words of English that I know. But he starts to walk inland from the Cleveland waterfront, up across Shaker Heights. He comes to a little town at the end of the day called Twinsburg, Ohio. And in the twilight, he sees a group of young men playing in the town square. And he just stands there watching them. Fortunately, one of the boys comes up to him and says, what do you want? And he says, I'm looking for my education. And the boy says, well, don't look any further, because here in Twinsburg, there's an academy. We're students there, and it's like the best school in Northern Ohio. If you're interested in attending, I'll take you over to meet the minister who is our principal. And so Andrew Blackbird was introduced to a man who had a huge impact on him. And that was, for the rest of his life, Samuel Bissell. Bissell arranges for Andrew to go ahead and become a student. He's able to pay his own way because he works in the morning as a blacksmith, and then in the afternoon, he takes his classes. But during summer breaks, Bissell and Andrew Blackbird go on a tour of the eastern United States, to Boston, to New Haven, to New York, Newark, Washington, D.C. And they go to these places and they go to Presbyterian congregations and they try to raise money so that Bissell will be able to educate other Indian youths. Andrew, who has now learned to read and write, is sending messages back to the Odawa saying that there's this missionary and he will give you an education where you will learn English. So now you can read and write Odawa, fine. But if you want to read and write English, if you want to do mathematics so that you can attend a school or become a clerk in a store, this is the place to come. And so other Odawa boys come to be students at Twinsburg. Among the Pokagans, Simon Pokagan becomes a student here as well. With this education, Andrew Blackbird begins to now exert leadership among his people. And so after several years at Twinsburg, he goes back to Little Traverse in 1850, just at the time when the Michigan State Constitution is changed. And there's a provision that says men of Indian descent, not members of a tribe, can become citizens. If you read the terms of the constitutional debate, what they meant was mixed-blooded individuals who were in fairly large number up at the Straits of Mackinac area. But Andrew says, why couldn't this be any Indian? And so he is sent by the leaders of the Little Traverse Bay Odawa on a long snowshoe journey in the middle of winter across the entire length of the Michigan Peninsula to finally gets to Detroit, where he looks up the head of the Michigan State Supreme Court. And he says to him, according to this Constitution, can my Odawa people become citizens? And can they still receive their annuities from their treaty? And the Chief Justice says, yep, the way I read it, that's fine by me. Andrew then goes to Lansing, which is a pretty miserable little mud-driven town at this point. And he goes to the governor and asks the same question. He goes to the state legislature and asks the same question. And they agree that Native people can become citizens. And in the wake of Andrew's mission, the Michigan State Legislature sends a petition to the United States Congress and says, don't go ahead and remove the Indians in northern Michigan. Instead, we are willing to make them citizens if you are willing to guarantee them land. Andrew, at this point, coming back to seeing, these burgeoning towns in Michigan like Lansing and Detroit, now aspires to get an education for himself that will build upon what he learned at Twinsburg, and perhaps he could become a medical doctor, certainly become a teacher. And so he attends the Michigan State Normal College, which is today, of course, Eastern Michigan University at Ypsilanti. He attends school there for 2 years, 2.5 years. It's very difficult for him because there's tuition that has to be paid, and he's working to pay tuition, and he has very little food. He's basically living on crackers and water, he says in a letter to Samuel Bissell. That difficulty, plus his father, Mekatepensi, falls seriously ill in 1853, and Andrew drops out of school, giving up his dream of becoming a medical doctor, but never abandoning the notion that education would be the key for his people. So in 1853, he goes back to Little Traverse and to his Odawa cousins. But when he comes home, he's got a big surprise for everybody, because while he was in Ypsilanti, he married an English woman by the name of Elizabeth Martha Fisk. He describes her to his friend Samuel Bissell as a very beautiful young English woman, well educated, who is willing to take all to a good heart that adversities we may meet during our lives, and willing to take hold in trying to enlighten my nation. And so he comes back to his Odawa people, very different than the young boy at age 14 who had first left. He's someone who speaks English fluently, he writes English very well, and he has a white wife. This isn't always popular, these features, with all of the Odawa people, but they sense that he is somebody who can be a valuable resource for them. And so in 1855, the government finally takes to heart the petition that the Michigan legislature had sent that don't remove the Indians from northern Michigan, but instead grant them land. And they negotiate a new treaty with the Odawa. And Andrew Blackbird goes to Detroit with a number of chiefs to negotiate this treaty. And he ensures that there is in this treaty money for schools for the Odawa. And these wouldn't be just Catholic schools now that teach the Odawa language, but schools that would teach the Indians what they need to act upon their citizenship. In the wake of this, the Odawa established in Emmett County basically their own county government, according to the rules set by the Michigan State Legislature. They elect an Odawa sheriff. There's an Odawa County Board. There's Odawa County Supervisors. There's Odawa tax collectors. There's an Odawa coroner. It's really a remarkable moment in Michigan Indian history. And the Odawa constitute over 90% of the population in that part of the state. They begin to shift their subsistence pattern now to focus. They'd always been pretty good at hitting the fur trade market, but now as Michigan is becoming more the industrial commonwealth, they now are focusing on serving an urban market. So they are going ahead and now fishing in a much larger volume and salting the fish and sending it down to Detroit. In the wake of the treaty, Blackbird finds himself dueling with federal Indian agents on the dispensing of funds that were guaranteed in the treaty for education. In the course of doing this, he writes an editorial in the Detroit Tribune, in which he writes, "We wish now to become men of knowledge and education, that we may hold equal standing with our white brothers. Since we have abandoned our laws, manners, and customs, having renounced our chiefdoms, under the most solemn declaration to uphold the government of the United States as directed by the President, the head chief of the nation." And what he wanted were schools where Indians would be taught well. For a time, for a decade after the 1855 treaty, there is a network of local schools for Native people taught by competent teachers. But when the treaty money runs out, those schools close. And only later does the Mount Pleasant Indian Boarding School become established. Andrew, for a while, uses his education as a teacher, but in 1860, when the Republicans are swept into the White House, Andrew Blackbird, who had become a dedicated abolitionist when he was studying at the school in Ypsilanti, is seen very favorably by the new Republican administration. And so he is named the federal Indian representative in Northwest Michigan, officially titled the interpreter for the Odawa. But it's really a much more important job than just interpreting, because the Indian agent for Michigan, and the Michigan Indian Agency is the largest in the United States at this point. He's based down in Detroit, down near the waterfront. And the agent only leaves Detroit once a year to journey to each reservation to dispense annuities. So it is the interpreter who is actually living with the Native people that is the true representative of the United States government. And that's Andrew's job. In the course of that job, he becomes a recruiter for the United States government and plays an active role in recruiting Odawa and Ojibwa men to fight in the first Michigan Sharpshooters. And some of you have been to Lansing and seen the monument there to the men of this unit, which was largely composed of Native people from Michigan. And they fought in some very bitter battles in the wilderness, in the Petersburg siege. Here we see a photograph of Payson Wolf, who was one of those Indian warriors for the Union. He was captured and sent to the Andersonville prison, which was, of course, a miserable hellhole, and he never recovered his health from his time of suffering there. After the Civil War, there's a great optimism among the Odawa, who feel now that they have earned a place as citizens in Michigan. But they are caught unawares by a rush of population, of white population, into Northwest Michigan. And this is what we would call the Green Gold Rush that sweeps over Michigan after the Civil War, when Michigan forests produce more millionaires than the California gold rush ever did. And as the value of pine timber in particular becomes acute, there are individuals coming into what had previously been overwhelmingly the majority Indian communities, coming in for the purpose of building sawmills, cutting lumber, and to access that lumber, separating the Indian from his land. Now, in the 1855 treaty, the United States government had promised each head of household among the Odawa a plot of land. But the government Indian agents botched this repeatedly. And so the land was not really awarded to Native people in the way in which it should have been. And so instead of this happening in 1855, when there were almost no white people living up here, and the Indians could have gone and set up their homesteads on their own land, developed the land, they're not given their land really until the 1870s. By that time, of course, there's a whole new generation of Native people who are heads of households. And they want land as well. And so a compromise is worked out in which these new heads of households, these young men who have now matured and have families, they're not going to get a guaranteed piece of land like the men who were heads of household in 1855. They're going to instead be given a chance to claim a homestead in the old Odawa reservation. And after they claim a homestead, the rest of the Odawa reservation is going to be thrown open for lumbermen to file their claims and exploit the forest products. Now, homestead laws are very different than if you don't really have a title to your property unless you've lived on it, improved it, and built a cabin there for 5 years. If in the course of coming to that 5-year period of time, your occupation of that land is questioned, then your claim is can be nullified. And the lumber companies hired unscrupulous agents, they were called timber sharks at the time, to go ahead and question these Indian homestead claims. So here's an example of what would happen, for example. In the fall of 1876, an Indian woman was absent from her house for 10 days. She was actually engaged in going to pick some berries that were in a different area. While absent, her house was forcibly occupied by a certain white man who took possession of the same, threw her furniture and possessions out of the house, and has resided there since. The said white man threatened to shoot this woman if she came back near the place. And after she went to get her things, the white man threatened on several occasions to chop her into pieces if she came back. This kind of intimidation often scared Native people from then trying to defend their claims. And they were simply happy to escape with their lives. In addition to this, general land office clerks would be given payoffs by the lumber companies to go ahead and invalidate Indian land claims. If an Indian took their case to court, they were confronted with a situation where everything was happening in a language that they were not too familiar with procedures that were completely alien to them and that were being massaged by attorneys of the lumber companies and oftentimes being presided over by judges who were being rewarded by said companies. Andrew Blackbird, as the representative of the federal government in this situation, is repeatedly going from one local court to the next to go ahead and help these people defend their claims. He's petitioning Washington that you've got to understand what's happening here. My people are losing their land. He is successful in getting federal investigators to come, and they document the fraud that was being perpetrated on the Odawa. At this same time, another that the Homestead, Odawa Homestead claims are being invalidated. The newly arriving white population in Emmett County is raising property taxes on the lands that have previously been bought by Odawa as private property or were claims that were granted them by the federal treaty. They're now having to pay large amounts of taxes on this land. And confronted with these tax bills, many times they abandon the land. Andrew Blackbird has been functioning as the federal representative, but also as the postmaster for Harbor Springs, Michigan. And when people complain that he's running the post office out of his house, he builds this building you see photographed here as a new post office. Yet that same year, he is stripped of the post of being the postmaster. And he is told, insultingly to his face, we don't want any more Indian postmasters. A few years later, his position as the interpreter ends, and the government pretty much abandons its attempts to defend Indian claims. Andrew Blackbird then tries to become the Michigan Indian agent, and he has some support in the Michigan state legislature for this. But in Congress, the lumber companies outmaneuver him, and with no debate, they insert in an appropriations bill a clause that says that the Michigan Indian Agency will henceforth be disestablished. There won't be an Indian agent in Michigan if we have to have an Indian in it. So this is a very bitter time for the Odawa people and for Andrew Blackbird, who has tried to use his education to help people, to go ahead and encourage the education of his people. Once he loses his position as a representative of the United States government, he becomes increasingly more alienated from his people. He already has a white wife, which doesn't set well with a lot of Native women. Most of the Odawa are Catholic or Methodist. Andrew has always been a bit of a free thinker religiously, has now become Episcopalian. And he can't help them anymore. Some people blame him because he didn't help them enough, though he felt he did all he could. And so he becomes a bit more, again, a loner, as he was when he was a teenager. Meanwhile, the Odawa homeland is undergoing major changes. Beginning in the 1870s, railroads begin to push their way up into northern Michigan. First, in order to go ahead and carry the lumber down to the cities, but then also to carry tourists north. Achu clubs, this is at a time before antihistamines were developed, and so people in the lower Midwest suffered terribly from hay fever, would often go up to northern Michigan and stay at these resorts for the entirety of the summer. Religious groups in particular began to form summer communities. And this creates a new opportunity for the Odawa. The men can use their skills as hunting and fishing guides. The women work in kitchens and can sell their crafts to tourists. Andrew Blackbird himself adopts the traditional Odawa costume and often gives speeches on Odawa customs and has himself photographed with tourists as a way to make money. Here we see Odawa women on Mackinac Island laying out their handicrafts. It's at this time when Andrew has lost some of his property to these timber sharks. He's lost his federal employment as a postmaster, as a translator. And so he tries to write himself out of property, and he pens the history of the Ottawa and Chippewa people, because he believes it's desirable that the history of my people should not be lost, like that of other tribes who previously existed in their country and who have left no record of their ancient legends and their traditions. He's helped in getting this published by friends, particularly women who belong to something called the Women's National Indian Association. And they have a chapter in Ypsilanti where he had gone to college. And Georgina Owen, one of those friends, writes to the publisher and says, I don't know, but Blackbird and his family will starve or die of broken hearts if something can't be done to at least get a pamphlet out before June. And so Blackbird's book, with their help, is eventually published. He goes on to write several pamphlets, this one being typical. The Indian Problem from the Indian Standpoint by Andrew J. Blackbird. And in this pamphlet, he criticizes severely the Office of Indian Affairs that mismanages American Indian reservations. But the main point of this pamphlet was we need schools for Native children, and not the kind of schools like you find at Carlisle or the Indian boarding school in Mount Pleasant. These schools teach Native children manual skills. Andrew says what Native students need to learn are the liberal arts so that they can learn the law and not have the law manipulated against them. But in many ways, his petition is falling on deaf ears. as the United States nationally doubles down on the boarding schools that teach just sort of industrial skills. Federal officials who are passing through Emmett County at this time describe the Native people as being treated pretty much the same as the newly freed African Americans in the South. That they're just basically second-class citizens whose rights are overridden by whites whenever they wish. Andrew Blackbird dies in poverty. He dies at the Emmett County Poor Farm in 1908. Here, among the detritus of America's rugged individualism, it's very much an anomaly for an Odawa man to be there. He had sons and daughters. Why he ended up in the poor farm is unclear. It could be that he suffered from dementia and that they were incapable of taking care of him. So we come to the end of Andrew Blackbird's life, and it's a modest life. It's the story of someone who tried to take advantage of opportunities that seemed to be opening up for Native people in the mid-19th century. That by seizing upon education, they could become part of this American Republic. But for most Odawa, that didn't happen. They ended up living on the margins of society in Michigan. The Christianity that Andrew Blackbird's father and uncle brought to the Odawa people, however, did help preserve Odawa culture. Through Catholic parish life, through Methodist camp meetings, Odawa people can come together as Odawa, and that Christianity becomes a vehicle for community life. Changing something like the Catholic tradition of All Souls Day, embracing that through the traditional Odawa practice of ghost suppers is an example of the way in which Native customs and Catholic liturgical practices blended. The Catholic boarding school in Harbor Springs, Holy Childhood of Jesus School, was a mixed blessing. For many Odawa children who were in poverty, it guaranteed them food and an education. But like so many of the boarding schools, something Andrew Blackbird did not anticipate, children were subjected to abuse there. Not just physical abuse, but sexual abuse, of course, as well. But it was because of the educational institutions, as flawed as they were, that the Native people began to claw back some of the rights that had been taken from them. And this really becomes clear in the post-World War II period, when the Northern Michigan Ottawa Association is formed. And they begin to file lawsuits against the state of Michigan and against the United States government to reassert privileges granted by the United States Congress and treaties. Eventually achieving, of course, in 1994, a reestablishment of government-to-government relations between the Little Traverse Odawa and the United States government. And in the 1970s and into the 21st century, through a series of celebrated court cases, the Odawa are able to reaffirm their traditional hunting and fishing rights as a way to protect an older way of life and a way of relating to nature. And new sources of tribal income came as well, of course. So if you go to northwestern Michigan today, you can visit the Andrew Blackbird Museum in Harbor Springs. And you can see in the top photograph, there is the post office that Andrew Blackbird built, but was never able to use as a post office because prejudice had stripped him of the opportunity for that job. So this is a different story than the way we normally talk about American Indian history. The individuals we know in the standard narrative of American Indian history tended to be warriors. People like Sitting Bull, Black Hawk, Tecumseh, Pontiac, Geronimo, Crazy Horse. And truly, these were leaders who fiercely tried to defend their culture. But in the end, what did they achieve? But death and displacement for their people. Noble as their efforts may have been, the results were disaster. Yet the Christianity and education that Mecca DeBensi, the Siganak, and Andrew Blackbird tried to bring to the Odawa have done much more to preserve American Indian culture. So when we think about an individual like Andrew Blackbird and the tragic end to which his life did come, we have to wonder, was that life a failure? Or could it have been a guide to the future? I think back to the words that Andrew Blackbird wrote in his pamphlet, The Indian Problem, from the perspective of the Indian. And in there he wrote, in the face of great antipathy and prejudice, there's no remedy but to educate Indians and permit them in the halls of Congress to protect the rights of my beleaguered race. I pray to God that somebody will step in my footsteps and continue to sing that same war song until every inhabitant, including the government of the United States, would deign to listen to this war song of education. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry if I ran over a little bit here, but that's the story of Andrew Blackbird and the Odawa people.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. And, usually around this time, I make a kind of a gag about how it's hard to hear applause through the internet, but I assure you it's there. And, at this point, we're going to get right into some questions that have popped up in the question and answer box in the chat. And also, I want to remind folks that if you do have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I will call upon you. The first person who asked a question was Graham Denton. And Graham asks, as a result of the doctrine of discovery, disease, warfare, and slavery were brought by Europeans to the Americas. Do you have an estimate through your research of how many millions of indigenous people died as a result of this Catholic conquest? And in parentheses, he says, which was justified by the passage of Romanus Pontifex in 1455 and Inter Cetera in 1493. Can you give us your thoughts on that?
Well, first, to the latter two citations, that certainly had a very negative impact on the people of American Southwest and South America. But the English and French who came in to the parts of North America where we live didn't give a hoot in hell what the Pope in Rome had to say in terms of granting of rights. They came in and took what they wanted. Now, what was the genocidal cost of the establishment of the American Republic? That's a very difficult figure to come up with. And it comes down to how many Native people do you believe lived in the area that is now the United States in 1492? And that figure, experts vary and disagree between whether that's 2 million or should that be 12 million. Probably 4 million is the number that I think most authors would kind of compromise on. So you're talking about several million people dying at least, so that our rich and powerful nation can occupy the lands it does today.
Looks like Graham has a follow-up question. He typed the following. Andrew once said, and quote, "But I have heard white people say that the Indians might just as well die, for nothing can be done with them, as they will always be wild and savage and cruel. They might as well all die or be killed, every one of them, from the face of the earth, for a dead Indian is better than a live Indian. These frightful statements are heard all over the United States, and every Caucasian child and every Indian child that is able to understand knows this dreadful feeling towards us. Therefore, there is no peace nor shelter for the Indians from injustice. They are exposed to hate, to be shot at, and to be robbed in every way and manner of their little possessions of lands which the government has allotted to them in treaties. They are cheated by the crooked works of the law." End quote. Do you think the Odawa and other tribes should be given reparations for treaties not honored by the U.S. government and for the illegalities committed by U.S. companies against the tribes?
I think reparations is a very, very tricky business for just about any group. However, I think first and foremost is, why don't you live up to the treaties that you did sign and which are still legally binding? That would be, I think, let's just do that first. And part of that is respecting the sovereign relationship that Native communities have with the United States government. So I think that's one thing that could be done. I think also that the United States, when you think about what's our whole history with Native people, could and should do a better job of providing the things that Native people need to live good and successful lives. And I don't think we've come anywhere close to doing the job that's necessary there.
The next question we have comes in the chat box. Now, the question is from, let's see here, from Museum. I'm not sure which museum, but hello, Museum. And Museum asks, have you been able to meet Eric Hemingway, historian for the Odawa and Abbott County, Harbor Springs?
Eric was a very helpful person to me when I was doing this research. Yes, so I have met him, and he was very helpful.
All right, the next question we have is a raised hand from Susan. So Susan, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Looks like you're still muted, Susan, so if you can unmute, go right ahead.
I didn't have a question. I hit the wrong button.
Oh, that's okay. That certainly happens. That certainly happens. All right. Does anyone else have any questions? If any questions out there? I think that's the sign of a good presentation, Professor. There's not a lot of questions at the end. It's definitely a stimulating talk, and thank you very, very much.
Yeah, you bet. And thanks everybody else for their patience in a long presentation.
Oh, we do have a question from Mary Strevel. She's raised her hand. Mary, why don't you go ahead and take it away? Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Ted. I was wondering if you have any historical fiction books that you might recommend on this particular subject.
Every time I fail to get any royalty checks for my nonfiction books, my wife brings up this point. Why don't you write a novel? I certainly have a couple of plots that I've laid out over the years, but never have had the discipline to see it to completion.